Welcome to the side event to the 19th session of the Assembly of State Parties to the International Criminal Court. Thank you all for coming today for Human Rights Documentation by Civil Society, a Pathway Towards Accountability event. I am Dr. Greg Noon, a Senior Peace Fellow at the Public International Law and Policy Group. PILPG is a global pro bono law firm that supports civil society organizations working on issues such as peace negotiations, rule of law, transitional justice, and human rights documentation. In today's event, we will discuss documentation, an ever-growing and important component of seeking justice for victims of atrocity crimes. We have an incredibly experienced group of lawyers and investigators who are well-versed in the needs, challenges, and developments of modern documentation. As many of you are likely aware, in the past 2 years, PILPG has published 2 reports on documentation. The first was documenting atrocity crimes committed against the Rohingya in Myanmar's Rakhine state in 2018. And the second is the recent Human Rights Documentation Solutions, Human Rights Documentation by Civil Society, Technological Needs, Challenges, and Workflows, Perspectives from Documenters, Transitional Justice Experts, and Tool Developers, launched on the 18th of November in 2020. During the launch of that Human Rights Documentation Solutions report, many attendees noted that they found it helpful to hear about the experiences of other organizations and share in the challenges that they face. Today, we will endeavor to respond to this request by sharing more about the experience of PILPG's Rohingya documentation and the insights of its senior lawyers. In the next 45 minutes, we'll zoom into particular difficulties civil society's documenters face when documenting atrocity crimes for accountability and share its experiences of documentation in connection to the Rohingya report. Our discussants today were all involved in the Rohingya investigation and subsequent reports, and are also part of the current PILPG Human Rights Documentation Solutions project, which has only recently wrapped up the first phase of 3 with the just published needs assessment report. As a housekeeping note, today's event will be recorded and available on PILPG's website following the event. Please put any questions you may have for the panelists in the Q&A, and any general remarks for the audience writ large in the chat. Speaking on the panel today, we have an amazing group of colleagues. Adrian Frick, a Senior Peace Fellow at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative and a consultant specializing in human rights and refugee-related issues in the Middle East and Africa. Her most recent publication with Physicians for Human Rights was released just 2 days ago and addresses the human rights issues of the COVID-19 pandemic in the context of the humanitarian crisis in southern Syria. Ms. Frick also conducted field missions in Bangladesh, Chad, Colombia, Lebanon, Sierra Leone, Syria, Sudan, and Turkey. She was an investigator on the Darfur Atrocities Documentation Team in 2004 and PILPG Bangladesh's Bangladesh Investigation Mission in 2018. Professor Margaret de Guzman is a James E. Beasley Professor of Law and co-director of the Institute for International Law and Public Policy at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In her capacity as Senior Peace Fellow at PILPG, Professor de Guzman advised on the Sudanese peace process and is contributing to our Expert Exchange Transitional Justice interview series. Professor Milena Stereo, the Charles R. Emmerich Jr., Calfee Halter and Griswold Professor at Law at Cleveland State University's Cleveland Marshall College of Law and co-coordinator of PILPG's Global Criminal Justice Partnerships, and is a leading expert on international law, international criminal law, and human rights. Bethany Houghton is a lecturer and researcher at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Bethany also serves as assistant counsel at PILPG, where she works on human rights documentation solutions. For the Netherlands office of PILPG, she is a project coordinator of the Virtual Human Rights Lawyer, a tool that uses technology to address the access to justice gap in relation to international rights law. So let's begin. First off, how can we, as civil society documenters, establish a methodology suitable for their accountability goals? The Human Rights Documentation Solutions report noted at various points that a strong methodology and workflow will assist with documentation. and establishing and refreshing this methodology is a common struggle for civil society documenters. Participants at our recent report noted knowledge sharing and best practices of documentation experts as helpful and welcomed more discussions regarding methodologies. And before we jump into the details of that, let's briefly summarize those who are a little less familiar. Adrian, if you could discuss briefly, what were the findings of the Rohingya report that was conducted by the Public International Law and Policy Group back in the spring of 2018?
Sure. Thanks, Greg. It's such a pleasure to be here joining you on this panel today. So in 2018, as you mentioned, PILPG published a report finding reasonable grounds to believe that crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide have been committed against the Rohingya in Myanmar's northern Rakhine state. And the report was based on the very large scale and comprehensive human rights documentation investigation in which we both participated as investigators. And it was designed to provide an accurate account of the patterns of abuse and atrocity crimes perpetrated against the Rohingya in northern Rakhine state, and to help inform policy decisions related to accountability.
Great, thank you. And we'll return to that in just a moment. But Bethany, if you could tell our audience about the Human Rights Documentation Solutions Report and what that is about.
Okay, thank you, Greg. The Human Rights Documentation Solutions Report is a response to the difficulties faced by human rights documenters in choosing and using technological solutions. PILPG recently conducted a thorough needs assessment of the challenges faced by documenters with respect to their technology. In the report, we found that there's no real one need of documenters, but rather there's a whole host of different challenges. And some main ones are establishing methodologies and workflows, the interoperability and challenges related to combining different tools, and also with analysis capabilities. And we'll be touching upon these, I think, later in the panel. But that said, there are also many more wide-ranging needs and challenges that we won't be able to discuss. But this report forms part of a project, a larger project to best equip civil society documenters with tools that will help them better document atrocity crimes and contribute to transitional justice processes. And in the next phase, we'll be co-designing a tool with 3 community documenters and a tool developer to assist with information management and analysis. It's
really an extraordinary undertaking. It's over a 2-year period. It's sponsored by the U.S. Department of State's Democracy, Rights, and Labor. At this point in that report, which I encourage everyone to read, we've interviewed well over 100 individuals from the field of documentation, transitional justice experts, and it's really a remarkable report. And that can be found on our website as well. Let's turn our attention back to the Rohingya investigation that many of us were involved in. Adrian, if I can go back to you, and you can talk a little bit about the methodology and how we translated that methodology into a practical workflow, how we did it on the ground, and what were some of the challenges there?
Sure. So the methodology was really special, I think, in a lot of ways, because it used not only criminal investigative methods, which are by definition qualitative, but also an epidemiologically based sampling survey design. And so as a result, so what does that mean? That means that in terms of both numbers of people interviewed, the number was designed to be extremely high. And in fact, we achieved 1,024 interviews, which is extraordinary when we consider that the setting was a refugee camp which had grown in a number of months to approximately, I believe at the time it was about 800,000 people. The Kutupalong camp is considered the largest refugee camp in the world. And I mean, the size of some congressional districts, right? So we're talking about very difficult terrain, and the approach that we used really guided our sampling in a way that allows us to have fair confidence that the findings are accurate, because both the choice of household as well as the choice of the interviewee within each household was randomized. And that requires a fair amount of training and discipline in terms of, how do we translate this grand design into something that is going to work on the ground? Well, the answer is training and planning. And all of the individuals who participated, each team was made up of an investigator, an interpreter, and then a local guide who was really necessary when managing transit within this incredibly large camp, keeping in mind that the interviews, we achieved saturation within each quadrant of the camp in order to make sure that we adequately assessed the population.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the important aspects of it, is that where I think a lot of people fail in these endeavors is they walk into the front door of the camp and they just interview the first 50 people they come across that may or may not have English speaking skills, right? And those people tend to be gravitated towards. They're the same people that the media or NGOs always kind of find, because they find them. So the camp itself was split up into dozens of different quadrants. And we had, based on the population of each quadrant, we had a specific number to achieve in that quadrant. You mentioned the training. Could you discuss a little bit about the documentation tools and the training sessions that went with that, and whether or not they were adequate?
Sure. So the essential tool we were using was the questionnaire that had been developed by the State Department, and it was in some sense an iteration of the earlier Darfur Atrocities Documentation Team questionnaire, which had a very similar research methodology. But, obviously in light of all of the lessons learned from past investigations, it was new and improved. And as an investigator, we had the opportunity to obviously review the document and other foundational documents so that we had good subject knowledge for those people who hadn't previously worked in the area. But then also we discussed it as a group, less about the elements of crimes because everyone is an attorney and knew that, but more about the ways in which we might need to deal with vulnerable populations, the specificities of individuals within the camp and the conditions that obtain there. We talked a lot about self-care in the field, which actually over time becomes your most important. It really is foundational, because if the investigator is unwell, either physically or mentally, and for that matter, the interpreter, the wellness of the team is critical to being able to conduct interviews and get good data. And any researcher will tell you, good data in is good data out, good analysis, and the converse is also true. Is that responsive to your question, Greg? Or...
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I find your self-care in the field to be illustrative. You and I were there together at the same time, and we were walking about 8 or 9 miles a day in very hot conditions, and frankly, we were shedding weight throughout the program. And I don't say that in a casual way. That can be a concern, because of course most of that is water weight. So self-care was a big piece to this. One of the other points I wanted to add to that was in the composition of our smaller teams. We always had a female and a male investigator partnered up together, so that if we did get into a situation where we needed a same-sex conversation with an individual, we had that with just a few feet away. And lastly, I would say our local guide, oftentimes the camps were so big and we're growing so fast that the local guides didn't even know where they were. And so we kind of had to do a little figuring out on our own, because not everybody understood when one camp began and when the next camp ended. Milena, did you want to jump in?
Sure, just one additional quick point about the methodology, which also goes towards controlling the sample and hopefully then ensuring that that the legal analysis is actually based on accurate information. In addition to making sure that you're talking to a randomized sample of individuals, as Greg said, you're not talking to just the first 10 that you encounter. The PILPG methodology also included excluding certain individuals, so excluding minors for good reason, excluding people who did not have firsthand accounts, excluding essentially what in the law we would call hearsay, and then also only interviewing respondents who had fled Myanmar since October of 2016. So not going further back in time. So I just wanted to follow up on the methodology, and I'm sure we're going to get into some of this when we talk about the legal analysis.
Yeah, but I'd roll us to the lessons learned idea here, and what part of the methodology, Milena, is most scrutinized?
So the reason that I think we're spending so much time on the methodology is that if the methodology is wrong, right, then then you can have thousands of pages of legal analysis that is based on flawed, wrong information. And you could say, oh, we think that, there's reasonable basis that genocide occurred, or there's reasonable basis that crimes against humanity were committed. And then you realize, well, that's based on this information that is skewed, that is flawed. And that could obviously be a serious flaw in the legal analysis. So I think having a non-randomized sample and having respondents who don't have firsthand information, I think that would be super important. That would be super wrong, if you will, in terms of the flawed methodology. I also think part of the importance of the methodology has to do with then the appropriate collection of information and the appropriate coding of the information that you collect. And we'll I don't want to spoil the fun that we'll have later on this panel, but part of it is then when you collect this vast amount of information, what do you do with it? How do you appropriately code it, which also then goes towards your ability to properly analyze it.
No, absolutely. And coding was probably one of our biggest challenges, and that coding was so critical as we sort through, as Adrian said, 1,024. And so making sure that all of our investigators, when they came back to look at their reports at the end of the day and go through the interviews they had conducted that day, making sure that we're all coding consistently. There are some easy ones, of course, but then there were some other ones. Well, is that, how do we code that? Are you coding it the same way we're coding it? And that will definitely create problems if you don't have everybody trained in the same coding, and continue the training. Not simply have training on day one and then send everyone to the field, but continue to touch back and have that conversation as we go through. Meg, I was wondering if you could jump in and maybe in your experience, kind of writ large, when we start talking about some of the common pitfalls that civil society documenters come across, from your perspective, what are some of those pitfalls that you see?
Sure. Well, from a very big picture point of view, and first of all, thank you so much for including me in this really important and interesting conversation. And I wasn't directly involved in the Rohingya investigation, so I do want to sort of just bring us out to the general level of what kinds of challenges can be addressed kind of for any investigation like this in a way that can lead to better outcomes. And I think the kind of biggest one is the question of what is the ultimate purpose of collecting the information. And I think that can often be a big challenge because we don't always know going into the investigation what the purpose is. And it can be a challenge on many different levels, including, for example, in dealing with victims who are, re-traumatizing to provide the information and not being able to give them a sense of what is going to be done with the information, if it's going to actually be useful in order for them to make the decision about whether or not they want to engage in the interviews, engage in the process, the sort of cost benefit analysis. And then from the point of view of collecting the information, the question of what it's going to be used for is very important in terms of things from sort of very nitty-gritty chain of custody type questions, right? The collection of evidence that is going to be used in a court of law is a different task than collecting evidence that is going to be used for a truth commission, for example, or for a more general report that serves more historical purposes. You have to engage in a different level of details for collecting evidence for a court. And then there's also this sort of big overarching question of whether whatever is going to be done is being done primarily for the population that suffered in the situation, and or whether there's sort of a more global purpose. In other words, are the particular goals of the local population or the population that suffered driving the investigation? And if so, how is that taken into account in collecting the relevant data? Or are there other goals? And if you're dealing with global civil society organization like PILPG, I think there often are other goals in mind in addition to those goals. And do those goals ever conflict? The sort of global goals conflict with the local goals, and how is that dealt with in strategizing about the collection of information? So those are some of the things that I think about on the kind of bigger theoretical level.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Bethany, let me go to you, because this is exactly what we dealt with in our latest report. This idea of having different types of civil society documenters in the field, in different understandings of chain of custody, and working through some of those issues. So if you could talk a little bit about that from the perspective of our new report.
So kind of in the report, what we were looking at, and I think that there was this one point in the process of drafting the report, we worked on this with the engine room and with HurryDocs, and we discovered that there was this conflict a little bit between what some of the interviews were turning out with regards to tool developers and how they conceptualized chain of custody, and how the lawyers were conceptualizing and interpreting chain of custody, and what that demanded of documentation and the tools that they were using. And in that sense, you have these different communities working in human rights documentation solutions, and everyone has this kind of common goal of accountability and justice for victims and communities. But when it comes down to these finer details, there is this tension in how you go about doing it. So with the chain of custody, lawyers obviously take the more legal standpoint, and they're applying the legal standards, and then the tool developers, the technologists are turning around and saying, but really, is it as safe as you're saying? The data will always be in the wild at some point if you use encryption. And encryption is pointed to by lawyers as being what maintains the chain of custody. And really what we found with the report is that what is necessary in dealing with these conversations is to have more opportunities of dialogue and coming together, where you have people who are experts in technology and the lawyers and working together. And I think these conversations are happening already, and lawyers are helping in development with tools such as Eyewitness that's really designed with the end user being lawyers in mind. But I think it's important that we continue having conversations between technology experts and lawyers and working together in that regard.
Yep, fantastic. Thank you. And I want to address two questions that have come in through the Q&A. One was, how did we pick the local guides? And I'll give you my 2 cents, but then I'll turn it over to Adrian. The local guides weren't really part of our investigation. Our interpreters were a much more important team member. And so when we did the training prior to, we worked with our interpreters. The local guides were more or less to get us to a location in the camp, because again, we were walking several miles. There's a point in the camps where no vehicles can go beyond. So you get dropped off and you start walking. Again, none of these roads or pathways have names or listed. So throughout the weeks that we were there, we would actually come up with our own names of the different roads and different locations based on what was seen, or you know, there was one place, a little kind of open area where they were always selling fish, and believe me, you could smell it from a long way away, and we call that Fish Square. So we would orient our going in and out through Fish Square, go to Fish Square, take a left, and you just kind of make do. So our guides weren't as important, and then they stayed outside of the dwelling, just to make sure that crowds didn't come in or other people didn't come in the dwelling. So they weren't involved in the collection themselves. But Adrian, if I could, you know, ask you to just talk about how important the interpreter was.
Sure, and I would just note that I also wrote a little answer as well, which basically reiterates what you just said, Greg. The interpreters were critical. I mean, really, in any interview, if you think of an interview with a population that doesn't speak, or in which the investigator does not speak the population, the language of the population being interviewed, the interpreter is like the third leg of a stool. Because if the interviewee is willing to speak, but the investigator cannot understand what he or she is saying or they're saying, then you just have a critical problem in data collection. And so the training of the interpreters, I think, was one important feature of this project, because they were not only, I mean, they were initially selected both male and female for their ability to speak the dialect, or a dialect that's very, very close to Rohingya. And keeping in mind that many of these individuals are like college educated young people who are living quite close to Northern Rakhine State. And in fact, my interpreter had spent a lot of summers there. So there's a lot of cultural continuity between these populations. And they were also trained by an ICC specialist, someone who works training interpreters to do investigations in areas where there is a pending ICC case. And so I think working with the interpreter is critical in the sense that, you know, they're very good at translating from one language to another, but it's really a team effort in the sense that investigators who have not had that experience before really need to keep in mind pacing, that it's physically very taxing for interpreters to interpret, you know, 8 to 10 interviews a day. And the content of these interviews is very difficult. And I think the experience of hearing the kinds of graphic atrocities that were being reported over that many hours of the day is, you know, for us as investigators, hearing it in translated into English, it was impactful, but I think it's even more challenging when you're hearing it in the language of origin. And we had to do some iterative work, you know, vocabulary really matters, verbs matter when you're trying to determine what kind of a violation or event happened. Things like colors or patterns that are important when determining the insignia on a uniform can be culturally determined. And so, so having a good working relationship with your interpreter was really critical to having good data, which, as Malena mentioned, is sort of the name of the game.
And two other points I would add to that, and thank you, Adrian, for answering Lindsay Green's question in the Q&A there. Two other things I would add to that is understanding of weaponry and understanding even where they live. That was probably one of the biggest challenges in getting people to where do you live? Where's your village? Where did it happen? And many people would give some type of answer like this. They would say, well, we're a 4-hour walk to Budagon. You know, they would name a village, a larger village down the road. Okay, a 4-hour walk. Well, you're an old woman or you're a young man. I mean, what's a 4-hour walk? Like, how far is that? You know, but that's just how far they know it takes them to get to the next village. So I think the map issue was probably the most challenging with respect to that. I will also say, and then as far as identifying weapons, it was a long gun. they kept talking about one gun that shot fire, and we were trying to sort through. Are they talking about a flamethrower? And so we're trying to work through that. The last point I would mention is about the trauma. We actually had a psychologist on our team for our team because of the things that we were hearing. And I can tell you that I've been to a lot of terrible tragedies, and this really was amazing because without sounding like a complete sociopath, I'm kind of used to hearing they surrounded the village, they killed the men, raped the women, and set fire to the village. This went to a whole new level of depravity. The things that they were doing. One story that sticks out for me was they selected a man to then select a woman for her to be gang raped in front of the rest of the village. Now, what kind of level of sickness do you put that? I mean, obviously, what's happening to the woman is beyond, but the fact that you're making a man from her village do that personal connection to then select the victim that they were going to terrorize with gang rape. Milena, let me move to you on this from the lawyer standpoint. How do you navigate these evidentiary standards that are required that get us to the next level, that get us to the ability to hold these people accountable?
Sure, thanks, Greg. And that goes to something that Meg said earlier in her comments, which has to do with the overall goals of documentation. If you don't set as your goal, as your initial goal, accountability, you're potentially going to be transferring this information to an accountability mechanism. You run into trouble because the information that you collected may not be on par with the relevant evidentiary standards. And the problem there for the PILPG, but in particular for more local organizations, civil society organizations that may be involved in documentation efforts, the problem is that they might not know anything about the relevant evidentiary standards. So they're collecting information that they believe to be credible, and then they might give it to a UN agency or some other international body or the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And the court might say, well, wait a second, you think this is credible, but this doesn't meet our evidentiary standards. And so here, what can be helpful, I'm kind of, paraphrasing your question a little bit, but I do think that you want us to talk about, overcoming some of these challenges as well. What could be helpful is particular technology tools that are designed to be able to take in evidence in a way that meets some of these evidentiary standards. For example, a video or photo taking tool where once you take the video or once you take the photo, it is automatically appropriately saved on your device in a way which meets the relevant evidentiary standards of the international tribunals or other accountability mechanisms. And this is actually one of the areas where civil society, local organizations need help from the international community and also from technology tool developers. So having more easily available tools that help them meet these evidentiary standards is really important.
Great, thanks, Milena. Meg?
Yeah, I just want to add to that I think we can acknowledge that the field has come a long way and that these tools have been a big part of that. And the increased involvement of civil society has been a big part of that. A book by Nancy Combs that's probably about 10 years old now called Fact Finding Without Facts comes to mind, where she did a very in-depth analysis of the judgments of several tribunals, the ICTY and ICTR in particular, and I think the Special Court for Sierra Leone, if I recall correctly, and found that many of the judgments did not rely on the kinds of factual analysis that would be required in many domestic courts. This happened at this place, this time, by this person, that they were sort of much broader brushes of patterns of conduct. And so the evidence wasn't as particular as we would normally require. And she did a very sophisticated analysis of the problem. I think one of the issues that we've seen at the ICC is precisely that doing that level of analysis is very difficult and very time consuming. And I'm hopeful that the development of these more sophisticated tools and the broadening of the involvement of civil society can make that easier, such that, because of course, when we're talking about crimes against humanity, for example, we're talking about proving not only the particular murder, rape, torture, the incident that happened at a given place on a given, by a given person, et cetera, but also that it's connected to this broader plan or policy pattern of conduct. And that's very, very complicated. So I think that these tools that we're talking about and the work that PILPG is doing in this regard is very, very important to try to make this process easier for these very, very complex evidentiary questions.
Yeah, thank you, Meg. Bethany, if you could pick up on that. And so where are we going?
Well, where are we going? I think that's a great question. I think that the general, the winds of change are really pushing in this direction of having multiple tools that will be doing all of these roles, these functions that we've been talking about. So, for example, collecting photo apps for collecting evidence and, you know, kind of automatically adding the metadata, and that there are kind of a range of different tools being developed. You, of course, have Eyewitness, but then there's also Proof Mode that are doing these functions. And I think, you know, kind of Proof Mode, I've mentioned this recently, but they have on their website something about how they they say that it's not been tested at court or something in tribunals, and it's a disclaimer that this has not been given the seal of approval by any court if you are to use this tool. And so I think what's coming next in the future is that from a legal side, from the lawyer's perspective, that as a legal community, we need to be looking at these tools and saying whether or not they do meet the standards, because from the tool developers' side, that they're left unsure whether the use of these tools will actually be found to be admissible at a court. So I think it kind of pushes both ways. And so once we do move past that and we have the dialogue between the lawyers and the tool developers, that then the documenters themselves will be more comfortable using the tools, because they know later down the line that the evidence that they collect will or will not be admissible, and they can make these informed decisions about their tools.
Yeah, outstanding. So before we wrap up, let me ask for some final remarks from each of you, and feel free to answer either one of these questions. So what are your last thoughts on human rights documentation by civil society and a pathway towards accountability? Or what key insights should a tool developer or a grassroots documenter take away from this conversation to inform their efforts in documenting for accountability? Adrian, can I start with you?
Sure. What a juicy set of questions. I think I'm going to speak to the second one. I think that what ends up being most useful from a documentation perspective is what might seem most boring or quotidian in the moment. And that is to say that investigators and the people who are helping them create tools to sort of scaffold the collection of data, right, in addition to just safeguarding it, really, you know, what ends up mattering a lot is things like, when does it happen? Where were you? How did you know? You know, evidence is something that tends to prove an allegation, right? And how do we know that? We know that through details. Sensory details, geographical details, time of day. And I think that when listening to really difficult narratives of atrocities, it's easy to become overwhelmed by the bigness of how terrible the actions are. But we have to remember, or at least I often have to remind myself, that what will matter to the investigator in 20 years are the details that might not feel important in the moment.
Great, fantastic. I'll go to Milena, Meg, then Bethany.
Sure. Thanks, Greg. And I hope none of my students are watching, because they're going to come away thinking the next exam I give is going to be like, answer this question or that question. But for this panel, it works. I think the overarching theme perhaps that unites both of your questions is that I think both CSOs engaged in documentation efforts and tool developers need to work with lawyers, not to overemphasize our own importance, right? But basically, if one of the goals of documentation is accountability, if you want to develop apps that help towards that goal, because they're going to help you collect and preserve and store reliable and then admissible information, you need to know what those evidentiary standards are. You need to know what the ITC is going to be looking for in the evidence that the person is collecting. So the tool developers need to work with lawyers, but then also CSOs documenting should be working with lawyers, should be working with the international community, again, if one of the goals is accountability, because it's only if they do that they can also know then what are our own processes that we need to implement in order to make sure that this information is reliable and admissible. And the second point I would just make is that there is really no one size fits all approach when it comes to human rights documentation. Different contexts present different challenges, and so you have to be creative and think of different ways to overcome those challenges.
Great, thank you, Milena. Meg?
Yeah, so I would say, sort of from a big picture point of view, looking to the future, there's a tension that's present in a lot of issues in international law, which is between sort of universality and pluralism, right? And we want to, on the one hand, it's great to have lots of different entities, organizations developing tools that, you know, promotes innovation, it helps with addressing different needs at different times and so forth. At the same time, it's often very important to have coordination and to have some overarching organization that facilitates communication among different entities to, you know, garner economies of scale, to ensure that people aren't duplicating efforts, that lessons learned are diffused throughout the people that are working on these issues. So as a final thought, I would really like to see some more overarching coordination happening. And historically, human rights documentation was largely run out of the United Nations. Of course, the United Nations hasn't been able to play as active a role in recent years for various reasons, funding capacity, you know, its technological levels of expertise are not always at the top of the game. But it would be great if either the UN or some other organization could serve as a kind of hub for the many spokes of this kind of civil society documentation work. So that may be something to sort of think about for the future.
Great, thank you, Meg. Bethany?
I think as a final thought from me, I'm going to kind of reinforce one of the key insights that we've been discussing in this roundtable, the launch, and from the Human Rights Documentation Solutions report itself. But it's really the importance of starting and thinking right at the beginning of where the end will be. So in thinking, you know, if it is accountability, or if you're also looking at a domestic court or a human rights court, what really is the end goal of the documentation, and that will inform the choices that you make at the beginning in establishing not just your methodology and your workflow, but in the choice of tools that you then need to use. And having that end goal in mind is really critical to have at the very, very beginning of documentation.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Bethany. You'll see in the Q&A, my colleagues are answering your questions as we go. There's also some information on the chat on the side, including some websites. I will say this has been an extraordinary conversation, but unfortunately, we're out of time. I'm sure many would agree that there's never enough time to fully finish this discussion. This recording will be posted on our PILPG website if you'd like to go back and look at it. Lastly, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank my colleagues, Adrian Frick, Milena Stereo, and Meg de Guzman, and Bethany Houghton, all four of whom who are just extraordinary giants in the field and in the work that they do day in and day out. I also want to thank all of those that have been involved in both the reports that we have published, as well as all of you attending today on this December 10th Human Rights Day. We admire and applaud your work in this incredibly important field of human rights documentation. So wherever you are in the world, I hope you're staying healthy, enjoy the rest of your day, and enjoy the rest of your time at the Assembly of States Parties for the International Criminal Court. Thank you.